Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ask the Expert. We're so glad everybody could join us this afternoon. We've got two fantastic Dutch experts with us today, Dr. Carrie Jones, Medical Director at Precision Analytical, and Dr. Debbie Rice, Assistant Medical Director at Precision Analytical. I think these guys are going to provide you lots of pearls of wisdom and clinical information, understanding Dutch test results, understanding what type of Dutch test to order. I think there's going to be a gamut of information today with these two. I wanted to let everybody know we received over 225 questions from everybody who registered for this webinar today, which is a fantastic turnout. We were very excited. So we can't answer all questions. We'll try to get to 30 to 50 questions. I think we feel like that's what we can cover in an hour. But because of the overwhelming response, we will continue to do this format. We believe we can pull this off quarterly. And if it looks like we need to do it more often, we'll try to make that happen for everyone. So without further ado, I don't want to waste any time. I want to get right to the experts. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Amy.
Yay!
I know. Are we ready? Are we ready to dive in?
I know. I almost feel like we're on Jeopardy.
Like a game show.
Yes. Yeah. So, Dr. Jones, are you ready? Because I have
ready.
a whole list of goodness for you.
I'm ready. Bring it on.
Okay. All right. Question number 1, Dr. Jones, what is the difference between testing blood versus urine hormones?
And you know what? As you know, we get that question all the time. So when you draw blood, so let's say you draw an estradiol, what you're looking at is literally the estradiol in that moment, the E2 in that moment in the blood. When you're doing urine testing, you are getting not only the estradiol, but you're getting where it goes. So that's the benefit of urine testing is you get the metabolites. So estrogen has to go somewhere, just like your androgens have to go somewhere, your cortisol has to go somewhere. And so the metabolite section of the Dutch test gives you that comprehensive overview. So yes, you have high estrogen, but why? Is it because your phase 1 is slow? Is it because your phase 2 is slow? Yes, you have acne and hirsutism and male pattern baldness. Why? Is it because your androgens are actually high, or is it because you favor the 5-alpha pathway? And so that's definitely the big bonus. On top of it, we can test throughout the day, and it's pretty easy to collect. So if you want a cortisol in blood, you're doing one blood draw, and you get a one-time cortisol, but it's a combination of cortisol that's bound to CBG, to albumin, and that's free in one amount, right? In one result. Whereas on Dutch test, we can give you 4. So we give you the circadian rhythm, morning, a couple hours later, around dinner, before bed. And we separate it. We give you free cortisone, free cortisol, we give you metabolized cortisol, and we even give you things like melatonin. We give you some catecholamine metabolite markers, HVA, which is a dopamine marker, and the norepinephrine epinephrine marker, VMA. So a much more comprehensive look when it comes to adrenals.
Seems like that might be a better deal.
Kind of. And it's easy to collect at home, especially for those who don't want to go in the lab right now and
yes.
are concerned about blood draw, right? They don't like to get their blood draw, they're scared of blood draw, or they just want to avoid contact with humans right now in a lab or in a hospital or something like that.
Right. And everybody pees.
And everybody pees. It's
It's easy to collect.
Yes.
Okay. Question number 2. I've heard for years from Pam Smith and others about the superiority of saliva testing for sex hormones. It seems that Dutch urine testing is superior. Can you explain how this came about?
Absolutely. So it's a combination of sort of what I just said, answering like blood versus urine, but saliva's been around a really long time and absolutely was, created because of the blood draw issue. People didn't want to get the blood draw. They wanted to see cortisol throughout the day. And so then saliva came around, and now you could easily spit into a tube, or not so easily depending, but you could do it at home 4 times through the day and you would get your cortisol and you would get your sex hormones. And since then, with the dried urine, it kind of brings it up that next level. It brings it up that next comprehensiveness, because not only do you get the same markers you're getting out of saliva, you're getting the metabolites with it. So again, you have somebody on, let's say, like an estrogen patch. You have somebody on an estrogen patch for HRT, and you want to know what's going on with their hormones. You do a Dutch test, you get what that estradiol looks like and how that patch is getting metabolized in the body. So you get more information, especially when you're looking at the sex hormones. And so the saliva is great, but with the urine, you just get that much more information when you're trying to come up with a treatment plan of like, are they on the right dose of their HRT? Or maybe they have severe PMS or endometriosis, or, you know, I keep picking on estrogen, but it's a solid example a lot of people can relate to, right? And so I don't mean to pick on estrogen. We love estrogen. We need estrogen.
Yes, yes.
But when it comes to, you know, why is she of PMS? If you did saliva and saw her estradiol is high in the luteal phase, you would go, oh, she's high estrogen. Why? Why? Is it aromatizing? Is it because metabolism or detoxification is off? And so that's the bonus of everything else you get with the Dutch test.
Or I would even say, yeah, I would even say in serum testing, if you have a normal estrogen, but she has estrogen dominant symptoms, you'd be able to see on the Dutch test, maybe there's sluggish metabolism of her estrogens going on.
Yeah, which is great. Same with saliva, right? You do a saliva test, E2 is normal, but she's heavy clots, breast tenderness, and then you do a Dutch test and you find out she actually favors what's called the 16 pathway, and the 16-hydroxyestrone is estrogenic. It's not as estrogenic as estradiol, but it's estrogenic. It binds to estrogen receptors and, you know, turns them on. So then you can say, oh, she doesn't have high estradiol. What she has is high 16, and let's do something about it.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. In an IFM mentoring session, the mentor stated that Dutch cannot be used for dosing of BHRT or bioidentical hormone replacement therapy treatment, that only saliva can direct dosing. Do you care to comment?
Of course I care to comment. Now, the great thing is that question would take, the short answer is yes, you can use Dutch, absolutely. You can use Dutch to monitor BHRT, bioidentical hormone replacement, or yeah, the hormone replacement. But the explanation is longer, and we have it. So what Amy's going to do, who introduced us, as she is our Director of Marketing and Education, Amy is going to pop in the chat some links for everyone. So we have guides, we have a chart, and we have some webinars on BHRT and Dutch testing. So even things like, you know, topical progesterone, or, you know, topical testosterone, or the estrogen patches or the pellets or the injections, you know, we have information on that. And so what I'm going to do is just redirect you. Yes, you can do it is the short answer. If you want more information on it, Amy's going to pop it in the chat, and then and if this is the replay, she'll put it in the email that goes out with the replay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Next question, and I'm going to actually combine these because these are very similar. The first part of the question is, how often should you retest, and how long should be suggested between test phases or testing? And then how long should you have patients on therapy for metabolites before retesting? For example, if they're taking DIM or calcium D-glucarate for, let's say, an elevated 4-hydroxy.
So how often to test? We suggest a baseline, and then we generally suggest 3 to 6 months thereafter. So what I tell people, I mean, you're the practitioner, right? So it's up to you how soon you want to retest. But we know in women, it takes 90 days to get from the antral, the preantral follicle all the way up to the chosen one, right? To the chosen follicle, 90 days. And for men, it takes about 70 to 75 days for sperm to make a sperm. And so for men, if you're trying to affect either fertility health, you know, even testosterone, women, you're affecting estrogen, progesterone, then at least 3 months is your minimum. Now, let's say you are an amazing practitioner, which of course you are, and she's feeling or he's feeling fantastic at 3 months. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling so much better. This plan is working. Can we just keep going another 3 months and test it 6 months instead? Yes, absolutely. Save your money and wait for 6 months. Now, let's pretend at 3 months though, they're like, you know, like some things are better, but not everything is better. When should I test? Like, go ahead and test now. Go ahead and test at the 3 month mark, and let's see. So, and then in regards to supplements like DIM or calcium D-glucarate or adrenal support, again, it's the same sort of thing applies. So it takes, if it's hormone related, it takes about 3 months for women. So 3 cycles to really see the biggest impact. So waiting at least that minimum. And if they're doing great and they want to hold off and test a little later, test a little later. It's fine. There's no hard and fast rule. There's no absolute. What I wouldn't do, which I don't think anyone does, is I wouldn't have a patient say, I feel terrible. And you're like, well, stay on the plan. Don't, let's not adjust or test. And, definitely meet the patient where they're at.
And then I'm going to tag on, because this was a very similar question following. How often would you test someone younger to see if they are responding to PCOS treatment or just managed by symptoms?
So it depends. So PCOS, if they have amenorrhea, they're not cycling at all. So she's a PCOS woman, hasn't had a cycle in months and months and months. Would I do testing, or would I follow symptoms? So if she's not cycling at all, I would do testing knowing I'm looking at the androgens and the organic acids and cortisol, but I'm going to know her estrogen and progesterone are low. She doesn't cycle. So it's not, we just know it's going to be probably down in the really low range, right? So with that, then I'm waiting. So, but in a young woman, let's say who does cycle, that we are treating, like maybe she's in her 20s, same rule applies then. Then I'm doing the like 3 to 6 month kind of thing, 3 to 6 month rule.
Okay.
Do you have anything? Do you have anything to add?
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, and I agree with, if your patient comes in and say they're doing great at 3 months and you're like, fantastic, let's just continue this and see what happens. But if they come to me and they're like, I either don't notice any difference or actually this has changed in my treatment, we're gonna test.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Agreed.
Cool.
Yeah. Next question is, I mainly treat PCOS. They start working with me likely not ovulating at all. Doing cycle mapping seems expensive when we already know they aren't ovulating. How would you test this population? And is cycle mapping that much better if we know that they're not ovulating?
This is a personal preference. Some practitioners do it anyway. They love cycle mapping. So cycle mapping is my most favorite test ever, but it is not for the, right?
Yes.
But it is not for the patient who is either not cycling, I don't think, or if you already know she's a PCOS woman who doesn't ovulate, don't wait. I don't think, don't spend the money to find out what you already know. She's not ovulating. Get her ovulating, and then if she's having symptoms, are either around ovulation or close to PMS, consider the cycle mapping if you need to. Otherwise, I think doing the Dutch Complete or the Dutch Plus and getting the snapshot of the androgens and the oats and the cortisol and even the estrogen metabolism, you can not ovulate and still be, right, relatively estrogen dominant. I think that is a great starting point. I do not do the cycle mapping if she's a not cycling PCOS woman, or not cycling any woman, or if you already know she's not ovulating. Don't run the test to tell you what you already know. So it's a great question. It's a solid question.
And I think it's a question we get a lot. So I think it's definitely relevant. Yeah.
For women with amenorrhea, most our team will tell women or tell practitioners, find out why she has amenorrhea first. The Dutch test is not necessarily going to tell you why she has amenorrhea. It may point you into some directions like check thyroid or consider PCOS. But a lot of that, most of the time, practitioners kind of have an idea, or they're running additional testing. Like, oh, you haven't had a cycle in 6 months or 8 months or whatever it is. Like, let's turn over some rocks and figure out why. And maybe it's not a testing thing. Maybe she's disordered eating. Maybe she's underweight. Maybe she's an over-exerciser. Maybe she's going through a horrible divorce. Maybe 2020 is kicking her backside, and
or COVID.
Right, like her GnRH signals are from the brain to the ovary. GnRH, FSH, LH are like, no. Yes. No. So then it's a brain issue, right? Then like, okay, we need to establish safety. We need her to feel safe, and we need to help the brain communicate with the ovaries. And so so going after the why is always with amenorrhea. I'm always like, start there. Try to get her. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next question. How clinically relevant is running a Dutch test in asymptomatic, otherwise healthy, postmenopausal women?
In a postmenopausal woman, I think as a practitioner, that depends what you're looking for. So if she's asymptomatic and she's coming to you just to check in, or if she says, I'm asymptomatic, but I just want to know what my estrogen metabolism is doing, or I want to know what my cortisol looks like, or I want to know if there's anything I can tighten up with my hormones, then run the test. But if she's coming to you and she says, I feel amazing, I'm doing amazing, I'm just checking in, you don't have to.
Agreed. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you'll have some of those patients that are like, oh yeah, I just kind of want to know where my hormones are.
Yeah. Even at postmenopausal, I postmenopausal women are like, I'm postmenopausal now. I'd kind of just like a baseline moving forward, just in case. I'm like, yeah.
And maybe they only want the adrenal portion, right? You can still just do the adrenal portion, given how important that adrenal component is for postmenopausal females too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Hold on. Okay, next question. Can you talk about the Dutch test for men? I have a client who's going to do the Dutch plus insomnia cortisol.
So first of all, you can absolutely do the Dutch test for men. 100%, it's the same test. You don't need a different test. All they do when they get to the gender section is check M as opposed to F. And then you get all the same hormones for male or female. We just change the ranges, of course, and run it as a male as opposed to running it as a female. And so we give all the same metabolism, all the androgen downstream markers, all the same cortisol, all the organic acids with men. And with the Dutch Plus, that's the cortisol awakening response. So it's the combination saliva swabs with dried urine. So it's the most comprehensive. And then the insomnia part is when, for patients who can't sleep and they wake up at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. or in my case 4 a.m. this morning, then they can
or
just
all of the above.
Or all the above. They can just pop the cotton swab in their mouth and will tell you their cortisol and cortisone at that moment. And so it's pretty nice. But for men, yeah, absolutely, not a problem. Men can do it.
Do you have any considerations about testosterone and the Dutch test?
Yes, so that is the one caveat. There is a mutation called the UGT mutation, and it turns out it's a lot more common than we thought. Surprise. So if you know your SNPs, if you know your SNPs, your patient SNPs, check them for UGT and see, because what it does, specifically for testosterone, is it affects the way you metabolize and clear out testosterone, not the way you make it. So it does apply for women as well, but we see it more readily in men because men just make more testosterone, so it stands out more. So what UGT will happen, so when you break down testosterone, most of it goes to testosterone glucuronide, and some of it goes to the sulfate form. Dutch picks up both. Our report looks at both in one marker, but like the large predominant amount of testosterone is glucuronide form. When you have UGT, you don't go through glucuronidation very well. You can't put that glucuronide on, right? And so what shows up is just the sulfate form, which is a really small percent. So men will look like they have next to zero testosterone, and it's not true. It's just the mutation. What testosterone does instead is it basically turns around and it just diffuses other pathways and becomes other markers, and that is different for every person. So with that mutation, with men, we still recommend you get a total, a free, and an SHBG testosterone in serum when doing a Dutch test. Pretty much regardless. It is definitely a caveat of Dutch. And especially when you're working with testosterone, with men, you should never just look at one marker, one testosterone, right? They say sort of the gold standard is to at least have 2, if not 3 testosterones before you decide, like, okay, they have low testosterone. I need to do something about it. But like if you're trying to clinically diagnose per se, you do have to have more than one low testosterone. But also keep in mind the Dutch testosterone is bioavailable testosterone. So testosterone is bound to SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, very tightly. That's why we pay attention to SHBG in serum. And then very loosely, it's attached to albumin. So it can get knocked off really easily and become free. And then you have free testosterone, which is, I'm free, I can bind to receptors and do the things. On Dutch testing, we look at bioavailable. So bioavailable is for men or women, doesn't matter. We look at testosterone and albumin and free testosterone. So it's free and almost free, basic kind of free, like easily freeable. So, but in blood work, you look at total testosterone, which is SHBG and albumin, and then you look at SHBG but independently. You can look at albumin independently, and then you look at free testosterone. So testosterone's not straightforward.
It's not simple at all.
It's not as simple as people make it out to be. Yep, there's more to testosterone than people think.
And I would include with the Dutch test, you also get that adrenal portion again, right? Because that's also going to influence not just testosterone, but how somebody's feeling, energy, motivation, all of that stuff too.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, next up, what is the best test to help a 2-year postmenopausal woman who is on estrogen and progesterone, and she wants to address her abdominal weight gain and bloating?
So for the hormone portion, right, all the things. For the hormone portion, she can do a Dutch Plus or a Dutch Complete. So if you want the cortisol awakening response, do a plus. And if you don't want the cortisol awakening response, you just want more basic cortisol, the 4-point cortisol, then do a Dutch Complete. Now for the abdominal weight gain and bloating, of course, obviously hormones and cortisol can play a big role, but there are so many other rocks to overturn that you may have to do some other testing to look at those as well, right? But especially with that bloating, right? It could be foods, it could be parasites, it could be candida, it could be just celiac, it could be, you know, the SIBO, it could be lots and lots of stuff. And then we know with abdominal weight gain, like that could be there's a lot of reasons. Now hormones and cortisol and organic acids and will definitely help, but most of us would probably agree it's not the end all be all. Like you'll have to dive a little deeper.
Yeah, it's not going to be the singular.
Correct. But for a postmenopausal woman on estrogen and progesterone, a Dutch Complete or Dutch Plus, pick a choice. They're great tests.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Next question is, I have a patient with atrophic vaginitis. I have addressed all the matrix, but she still has too many symptoms and I do not know how to help her. Could the Dutch test guide me to find the problem?
I think so, absolutely, especially given the hormonal component of atrophic vaginitis. Yeah.
I agree. I do Dutch testing for my atrophic vaginitis patients too, and it can be super helpful. Oh goodness. Every time I try to use my little arrow, it tries to throw me off. Okay, here we go. How would you use the Dutch test in cases of hypothalamic amenorrhea? First, let's talk about what is hypothalamic amenorrhea.
So hypothalamic amenorrhea amenorrhea is when you don't get a period, right? Hypothalamic is because it's not communicating from the hypothalamus down, right? So there's the signal there, for whatever reason, the signal is not happening. Now there's primary and secondary. So it can be primary because of like a thyroid issue, right? It can be, or prolactin, or what I'm trying to think of, like common hypothalamic reasons, or excuse me, that's secondary. That would be secondary.
Yeah, secondary.
Those are common secondary reasons. So the first thing is you've got to figure out, like we said, we would suggest if she's not cycling at all, then if you do the Dutch test, her estrogen and progesterone will probably be quite low. So I would not recommend the cycle mapping. You know she doesn't cycle. Don't spend the money on what you already know. But what the Dutch will give you, again, are the androgens, are the cortisol part, are the organic acids. And you can just do the cortisol part. You can do the cortisol part and the organic acids. So you can get more information, like maybe the hypothalamic amenorrhea, like maybe cortisol, norepinephrine, epinephrine has a big role or has a partial role in it, especially with secondary. And so you can partially test or look at the androgens too as well if you're suspecting, you know, that it's like a PCOS picture. Like you thought it was hypothalamic amenorrhea and turns out she's got PCOS. And that's really the reason. So
yeah, and I think
go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think it could give you ideas of where to go with testing from there too, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in the cortisol section. For those who don't know, the cortisol section, the free cortisol and there's metabolized cortisol, and there's specific patterns that we look for. And one of the patterns, or two of the patterns, can point us towards a thyroid issue. And so when metabolized cortisol is low and free cortisol is high, so on the Dutch test, the arrows kind of like they face off like each other, so to speak, then it's can be hypothyroid, subclinical hypothyroid, low thyroid. And so if you see that with somebody with hypothalamic, what you thought was hypothalamic amenorrhea, you might go, I should probably dig way more into the thyroid than I did, or that the practitioner who referred to me did. and give you some idea. Now, when the dials face opposite, when metabolized is high and free is low, then it's maybe more hyperthyroidism. So they could have Graves' disease. They could be in the hyper state of Hashimoto's. Maybe they're on too much supplementation or too much medication, and they pushed them into a hyperthyroid state. So we can use those adrenal dials to sort of guide us in other directions. We are not a thyroid company. We don't test the thyroid. That gold standard for that is in the serum. But we can use those markers. Like the literature shows, thyroid does have an impact on metabolized and free cortisol. So we can at least be like, when was the last time they got a full thyroid panel and some antibodies? Like, maybe it's time we do that.
Yeah, or even if everything is just all bottomed out, right? Then like, let's look further up the chain too.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, I know there are a couple parts to this question, so I don't know that we'll be able to answer all of them, but which Dutch test should be used to assist a patient in resolving a fibroadenoma?
So again, you could do a complete or a plus, you know, looking at the hormone part of it, or you could just do the sex hormone part of it when you're looking at estrogen, progesterone, and the estrogen metabolism.
And same thing with PCOS, which we've kind of already talked about. The next part of the question, is it possible to help a patient wean off of hormone replacement, and what resources are available to providers once the Dutch test results are available?
So for the first part of that question, can you help a patient wean off of hormone replacement? You can. Just make sure you know what you're doing, that you know how to support her or him, and like you've had training. And so unfortunately, that's definitely outside the scope of this webinar. But you know, it's possible to wean them off of HRT. It's not always possible, but it's definitely possible. But don't just decide you're going to stop her off her HRT or even like thyroid medication, and unless you know what you're doing. Now, to answer the second part of the question, when you have a Dutch test, what are the resources available? We have tons of resources available. We have an entire education section on our website that has like videos, tons of videos. Everything is free. Everything is available for you to watch. All of our podcasts, all of our webinars, including this one, will be up there in that section. We do have 11 doctors on staff now, 11 doctors on staff now. So we do phone consults Monday through Friday for practitioners. And so we have that option. We do a lot of email support. When we could do conferences, we're at conferences. We support a lot of conferences, so you can definitely come talk to us at the virtual booths, and eventually when it's live again at the real booth. And so we have a lot of options, and we have more. And what's great is we have a lot more coming. We had like our blog, our social media, more education is coming. We have an entire, like, we are so excited to build this out. So stay tuned, but definitely use what we have. Yeah, and you can also link that in the chat too, some of the links for the webinars and podcasts and our videos.
I would also add on to, you know, is it possible to help a patient wean off of hormone replacement? I would say why. Like, what is the why? What is the underlying reason that you're wanting to do that? And then definitely know what you're doing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah,
because I think sometimes practitioners get a little overzealous as they're like, oh, hormone replacement's bad, I'm going to treat them, I'm just going to substitute a supplement for the hormone replacement and hope for the best, or you know, like get them off a medication. Sometimes the one thing's saving their life, and you have to be careful.
Yes. Yeah. Well, or even just ideas of, oh, this person, you know, females should only be on hormone therapy for this many years or until this certain whatever. And there's a lot more research coming out that, you know, you need to be well versed in that and understand what that means, not only for you as a provider, but also your patient and their quality of life.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Definitely.
Okay, next one. Okay, when assessing HPA axis function or hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis function, how to use both DHEA, which is DHEA-S, DHEA total, and cortisol levels, which are free and total, as well as the circadian rhythm, to degree or stages of HPA axis dysregulation. Can Dutch test reflect the degree of HPA axis dysregulation comparable to other models of the 3 stages or 7 stages of adrenal fatigue?
Adrenal fatigue, I know.
Yeah.
So because Dutch is a lot more comprehensive than the simplistic saliva model. So the simplistic saliva model is you get a free cortisol, you get a DHEAS, and then that's what they're basing everything off of. But with Dutch, when you get the metabolized cortisol, which tells you how much, kind of a total, right? Total cortisol production and metabolism in that day. Because think about it, the adrenals make cortisol, and then some of it's free, some of it's bound to transcortin, cortisol binding globulin, and then the rest of it gets metabolized. So if you make 1,000, but only 100 is free and 400 is bound, then all the rest of it's got to get metabolized out. But at least it tells you could make 1,000. So it gives you an idea of potential. On top of that, we give you free cortisol, like I said. So how much is free and available, and in what pattern does it follow? Does it follow a normal pattern? And then we give you cortisone, so which is inactive. So we can tell you how much can you make, how much of it is free, and do you deactivate too much? So it doesn't fit into the nice box that people have of like the 3 stages, the 5 stages, and the 7 stages of HPA axis dysfunction, because we're looking at multiple levels. But what we know about the different levels of HPA axis dysfunction is that it's kind of gray and sliding. Like like when somebody's like, oh, I'm in stage 7 adrenal fatigue, I'm like, well, then you've got to have Addison's, because first of all, who created to stage 7, right? Or stage
you have to go through the 6 first.
I know. And the body to a degree is resilient, so you can have low cortisol, but maybe your metabolized cortisol's fine. You've low free, but your metabolized cortisol's fine. So you were diagnosed on saliva test as stage 7 because your free cortisol's low, but when you do a Dutch test, you're like, oh, actually my metabolized cortisol is maybe high, and it turns out really what the problem is I'm hyperthyroid, or I'm on too much thyroid medication, or it's stress. I am fighting an infection and have a lot of inflammation. Therefore, my body's making but clearing a lot of cortisol, leaving very little free cortisol around. The symptoms are the same. You're still tired. I get that. But the diagnosis of you're a stage 5 or a stage 7 or a stage 3 is a lot more complicated and complex than people have sort of brought it down to, which I understand for simplicity's sake. It's easy to explain to a patient. Patients really like to say, oh my gosh, I'm adrenal fatigue stage 7. Like, it's no wonder I'm tired. Like they want answers, and and their symptoms are real. I'm not debating that at all. I fully agree with them. But it's the physiology behind it that I'm like, we just need to get the physiology right. That's like, let's be correct about how we explain the physiology to patients or to the world at large. Like, can you make it? Do you deactivate it? What's free? What's bound? Is your rhythm normal? Your circadian rhythm? That's what we're looking at. And then keep in mind, it all starts in the brain and it ends in the mitochondria, which we talk about all the time, right? So it's brain signaling, we know, starts with hypothalamus and the pituitary, and then where the cortisol is actually made is the mitochondria in the adrenal cells. So if you have brain issues of any sort, or blood flow or lymphatic or nerve issues of any sort, or if you have any kind of negative feedback loops kicking in, or if you have poor mitochondrial health, weak mitochondria, sick mitochondria, like think of your mold patients, right? Like think of your Epstein-Barr patients. Think of your pathogen patient, Lyme, like their mitochondria is not doing well, and as a result, often their cortisol and their other hormones aren't either. So is it quote unquote stage 7 adrenal fatigue, or is it that they have a terrible miscommunication from the brain down to the mitochondria, and we need to sort of rethink how we say it? Yeah, so that's, I know what I say is kind of controversial. I mean, I know Hans Selye is who came up with the 3 stages of adrenal fatigue, and to describe stress. And there's been a lot of like work since then, and there's a lot of controversy since then as to, are you stuck in one? Like, if you're 2 or 3 or 1, like, are you always that? Or like, can you be 1 today and 3 tomorrow? Like, yeah, you can. Like, your body's adaptable,
Totally can.
and it can, depends what's happening today versus tomorrow. It's not,
and as much as like the stage 3, for example, is a great like blueprint, very simple way to look at it, it's so much more complicated when you look at what's happening. And I mean, it's not like your body just happened to be there, right? Like your body creates certain patterns that get you to this point. And once you are either labeled, I know a lot of people like to have something to identify with, but once you're labeled that way, it can change. Your body changes so much, either from day to day or week to week, depending on what you are doing to influence those patterns too, I think.
Yeah. And one of the things when we had Dutch Fest last year in 2019, the owner, Mark Newman, came up with this sort of, he explained the endocrinology of, the conventional endocrinology was like you have Addison's, you have Cushing's, and then if you don't, then you're normal, which we know is like crap. And then what he said was he called it more of an adaptive, hello hair, an adaptive state. So you can have Addison's, you can have Cushing's, and then you can be like at the low end or the high end, or then you can be somewhere in like the gray area that's more of adaptive. Like some of your markers are high, but some of your markers are low. You don't feel well, but you don't have a clear, you're not like stage 4. Like there's, but it's more of this moving state that we're going to, but we know what to specifically address because we have all of these tests to tell you versus just a free cortisol and just a DHEA. I think it explains the physiology a lot better for people. I know they like labels, just like you said, but to like real physiology, that's why I like Dutch, because I'm like, oh, here's what the issue is. Like you have low free cortisol because you deactivate to cortisone. You're not adrenal fatigue stage 7, you deactivate. You have an upregulated 11 beta HSD2. So let's address that.
And I think the Dutch helps you, at least for me as a practitioner, it makes me feel more confident moving forward in my plan because I have all of those extra details. You know, it's not just that there's a low free cortisol and we're just gonna
give liquor.
Yeah, because that it may not be a cortisol production issue, it's a cortisol use issue, right? So that's important too.
Yeah, I agree. See, tangent. Now that we're
I know, right?
Dr. Johnson, they'll get off their soapbox.
Okay, are we ready for the next question then?
Totally.
Okay.
For sure.
When you have a 20-year menopausal female patient who has HPA axis and CAR, cortisol awakening response problems, what benefits does the Dutch test provide other than information about how the patient is processing and removing her hormones?
So, all of the above. She has HPA axis issues and she has cortisol awakening response issues. And you know that the Dutch can test both. We look at, like we've been talking about, metabolize free. We do the cortisol awakening response. We do melatonin. We do some of the organic acids. And oh, by the way, we can tell you how the body is processing some of her hormones, like estrogen or androgens. Then that's a pretty serious bang for your buck. So that's how it benefits patients.
Well, and the cortisol awakening response is even like opening another door into that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal function, right? So it's just another additional component of where this patient is at and being able to evaluate that.
And it really helps narrow down, I think, treatment and even timing, versus saying like, here, take these adaptogens in the morning, as an example. If somebody has a low cortisol awakening response, we know that the signaling from the brain to the adrenals is not great. The resiliency is not great. It puts them at a risk for a whole bunch of comorbidities. And so now we can narrow in to be like, oh, like within the first 30 minutes of waking, this is what you're going to do to help get your cortisol awakening response back online. And here's what we're going to do at night to help your brain so that you have a better cortisol awakening response in the morning. And that's why we like that test, because for those people who need it, the CAR, the cortisol awakening response, it just helps hyper-focus in that much more to be specific for that patient.
Yeah, I agree. Next question. How do you explain to a patient the cause and solution to a large difference between the total metabolized cortisol and free cortisol?
So that's a really good question. And actually, if you had signed up for our Dutch test videos, in the adrenal section, we go over this quite a bit. But for a little recap, so when metabolized cortisol is low, and free cortisol is high, so low metabolite, low production, but high free. The most common reason that we see is hypothyroidism or something going on with the thyroid. So subclinical hypothyroidism, you know, or even, it doesn't have to be overt, but maybe it is subclinical. However, you can also have just generally poor liver function. So you can't metabolize the cortisol very well. The enzymes in there are slow. History of anorexia or disordered eating. The problem with that is that there's not a lot of research on definitives. So people will say, my patient was anorexic in their teens. Is that going to affect them now? I don't know. Or my patient is recovering or working through. I have an adult who is disordered eating. Is that going to be affecting them right now? And if as we get that worked on, how long will it take to fix the liver enzymes? I don't know. The reason the liver enzymes slow down, we suspect, is because when you are not eating, then the body goes to save you and protect you, right? So the enzymes slow down metabolism of cortisol to keep more free cortisol available in your body. We think it's a protective mechanism. In the literature, they just talk about it. Anorexic women is usually who they study, tend to have slow liver enzymes. But then another group that I found recently, they did a study on critically ill. So critically ill, like in the ICU, but they haven't done critically ill. I mean, we definitely have people that aren't ICU worthy, but we would define them as is pretty critically ill. I mean, we have patients, you know, that are like, wow, that they're really like, I can't believe they're not in the hospital. They're suffering from a lot. And so that critical illness can slow down the liver enzymes. Now, on the reverse, if you have really high metabolized cortisol, so that dial is high, then it's usually like the typical fight or flight things you're thinking. Why is the body making so much cortisol? It's stress, it's inflammation, it's insulin, it's infection, obesity. All those things will ramp up cortisol production, thus processing through the liver. And so, and as a result, what can happen is the free cortisol is getting swept out of the liver and into the urine, and therefore that marker starts to go down, down, down. So it may have nothing per se to do with the adrenals, and have these other things are affecting the adrenals or even the liver's effect on how cortisol is metabolized. So think thyroid, hypo or hyper, depending, and then go from there. So liver function, anorexia, critically ill, stress, inflammation, insulin, what have you.
I'm going to tag on to that with anorexia. It's a very similar picture to overtraining. So people that are athletes, competitive, that also drives your body to a place that can look anorexic too. So having that on your radar as a provider as well.
Which is common. Overtraining is common.
Yeah. And I think when we're talking about the cause and solution for patients, when we see these types of, you know, is it obesity? Is it insulin? Is it inflammation? Getting, you know, real and true with your patient of like, what is your lifestyle like? How are you dealing with stress? What is your stress? What is your environment? What does that look like? Because a lot of people think, well, I'm going to get this test done. I'm going to be told to take these things. And what do we always say? You can never out supplement a poor lifestyle. So if you are making crappy choices with diet, if you are not sleeping well, if you are not managing your stress, you know, supplement and support can only go so far if they're also not doing it. So I think that that's an important component to have in the conversation with your patient.
Totally agree. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Next question. What are food and lifestyle treatments for low cortisol and high cortisone? And what does high cortisone actually mean, Dr. Jones?
Yes, cortisone's inactive. And so there is an enzyme, 11-beta HSD. So 11-beta HSD1 activates to cortisol. 11-beta HSD2 deactivates to cortisone. So the body is smart, and the body has a lot of 2 in places that have a lot of mineralocorticoid receptors, because you have a lot more cortisol than you have aldosterone. And so the mineralocorticoid receptors are like, save me from cortisol. And so the body's like, cool, got you. So in the intestines and your saliva glands and your sweat glands and the kidney, the body will deactivate quickly to protect the mineralocorticoid receptors. And so what can happen is that if you have a lot of cortisol sort of, you know, trying to bind onto your mineralocorticoids, the 11-beta HSD2 will deactivate it. So when people say, well, what food can sort of reactivate it. I don't find foods per se, but what I will say
Mhm.
is that when you do tend to favor cortisone, we find that it's the body trying to get you to slow down. Like, why do you have so much cortisol attacking your, not attacking, that's a bad word, binding to your mineral corticoid receptors? Leave your little mineral corticoid receptors alone, cortisol. So why is the body trying to get you to slow down, right? And so if you're like, well, I'm gonna cheat the system and I'm going to reverse the enzyme, which the supplement is licorice. Licorice pushes you from 2 to 1, so then you will reactivate to cortisol. But you didn't address the cause. You got to address the cause. I mean, the body's just going to be like, deactivate, deactivate. And then you're going to take licorice and it's going to be like, deactivate, deactivate, right? You have to address the cause of why you're deactivating in the first place. And so you can use licorice as a Band-Aid to help aid along as you're addressing the cause. But yeah, so find out why. Why are you burning the candle at both ends? Why are you sick? Why are you, so tired? Why are you burned out? Why are you not resilient anymore? Why has your body decided to tell you to slow down and be tired? You have to address that. And then foods go with that, right? Foods go with that. So if you are eating foods that are maybe routinely stressful for your body, along with everything else, it's not helping the situation. But there isn't a food that I know that like turns
I would just say inflammatory foods, and that can be different for every person, right? So it's definitely evaluating that individual response to diet. And when we're talking about diet too, I don't think it's just the food that you're putting in your system, it's the timing of food that you're putting in your system too. So that's also part of that stress on your body.
Good point. Yeah, absolutely. Insulin response for sure.
Totally. Yeah. And just remember, sometimes, I mean, poor cortisol, like we love cortisol, kind of like estrogen. But it can be a bully. And, if cortisol is feeling stressed and it's trying to protect you from a saber-toothed tiger, your body doesn't know the difference between, your work schedule and being on line forever versus running from a saber-toothed tiger. So it's also evaluating, like, why are you getting those cortisol signals and why is your body trying to protect you?
Yeah. Especially now, school comes back into session. I've had more provider moms say to me, like, I don't know how I'm going to see telemedicine patients with my clinic and do homeschooling, and this whole new normal thing is really stressful. It's really hard, and it's true, and it's showing up on Dutch testing and in our lives.
Yeah, and stress is not, it's perceived too, right? It's not just the actual, like, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. Like, that perceived stress is also still going to like, your cortisol doesn't care if you're responding to stress, whether it's real or not. It doesn't have like a meter that goes through and it's like, oh, well, that's fake.
Yeah, like a filter, right? There's no
yeah.
The filter is our frontal cortex, and our HPA axis doesn't go to the frontal cortex. Our HPA axis goes straight to the adrenals, or it goes through the sympathetic signaling, right? So catecholamine release. If we went to the frontal cortex to go, is this really that stressful? Most of the time, the frontal cortex would go, no, that's not that stressful. This is not life or death. Like, that's just a stupid text from your neighbor. Like, no, this is not a big deal. That's just, whatever. The dog is barking. Like, no, that's not stressful. It's just a Zoom meeting. Don't stress out about it.
Right.
But we don't go to the frontal cortex. Cortisol and epinephrine go through different channels.
we run from that saber-tooth tiger.
Right.
No matter what it is.
That's what we do. We stress out.
Yes. Okay, next question. How have you seen mold toxicity and or Lyme cause endocrine issues?
Big time.
Yeah, totally. I agree. What strategies did you use to correct or fix the issues? And do you see patients' endocrine system make a full recovery, or are there times that you need to bring hormonal support on board?
So I would say for mold, mycotoxin, Lyme disease, yes, absolutely affects the endocrine system. I mean, it affects every single system in the whole body. So let's just say yes to that. How do you correct that? Unfortunately, this webinar is not the time or the place for that. But the good thing is there are plenty of experts. There's plenty of conferences. There's a lot of online education right now about mold, mycotoxin, and Lyme that we highly recommend you go check out and get educated. There are books written by great practitioners on these topics. Definitely read yourself up. Now, are there times that you need to bring hormonal support on board? Yes, absolutely. And the Lyme and the mold practitioners will tell you that there's definitely times when they're like, you know what, we just need to give you the replacement because you just can't like you're struggling right now. So let's just give it to you while we're working on everything else to help you feel better faster and have more oomph and, you know, feel more like yourself and work through the recovery. So yeah.
I agree. Next question is, on the report, it shows metabolism of estrogen, but not how progesterone is metabolized. Can you show me on a Dutch test where I can see if progesterone is being metabolized effectively? I would love for you to briefly review how progesterone is metabolized and excreted.
So if you just Google search, whether you like Google or not, they go for images, go for Google images. So we on Dutch testing, we show you the alpha and the beta, the pregnanes. So we do 5-alpha and 5-beta pregnane diol. And now progesterone itself metabolizes into about 16 different metabolites, of which we checked 2 main ones. So first, what it does is it gets broken down there, and there's 3 different enzymes that are involved. So there's 20-ketosteroid, there's the 5-alpha reductase, which 5-alpha reductase is 3 5-alpha reductase and 2 subunits, I think. So that's 5. Like there's 5 of those guys or girls, depending how you look at it. And then it's further reduced by aldoketoreductase, which is AKR, oh, I've written down AKR1C1. So it's really, so progesterone metabolism, to answer your question, is really complex. But we do look at the 5-alpha and the 5-beta pregnanes. Now it's the 5-alpha that goes on to create allo, or makes allo, ALLO. And it's that allo, it's the 5-alpha pregnanes that cross the blood-brain barrier, and that's what support GABA. So if you have anxiety or insomnia as you get close to your period, or if you don't ovulate, or as you become perimenopausal, menopausal, because you're missing out on the 5-alpha form, the allo form of progesterone. But on the other hand, for those women who suffer from PMDD, right, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, that it's the fluctuation. Allopregnanolone is a neurosteroid, and because it crosses the blood-brain barrier and works in the brain. So the GABA subunit can't change itself effectively enough for the fluctuating levels in the allo neurosteroid. And as a result, these women suffer from PMDD. They actually have a negative effect with their GABA receptor as opposed to positive. So they actually benefit from having lower levels of 5-alpha, or even considering some of the 5-alpha blockers, which we tend to talk about with androgens, right? Testosterone, we talk about saw palmetto or pygeum or reishi mushroom or EGCG. But for PMDD sufferers, we can show you on Dutch tests, like here's her 5-alpha and she has PMDD. So one of the options is to help push her to the beta side, especially if she gets close to her cycle, and see if that helps. The 5-alpha to 5-beta in progesterone, it's often genetic. I will get asked what, like, can I make her a beta person? Can I somehow switch her? Is there a food for that? There is not. There is not a food for that. But we know the 5-alpha in general is upregulated through inflammation and infection and cortisol and insulin. So all the same things that upregulate the 5-alpha for androgens could do it for progesterone as well. So if you have an insulin resistant woman with PMDD, addressing the insulin resistance will help. If you have a highly stressed out woman with PMDD, reducing the cortisol, thus reducing the stimulatory effect on the 5-alpha enzyme, will help. It may not be a magic cure, but it's helpful.
At least a step in the right direction.
Exactly. So going back to the original question, progesterone metabolizes into about 16, 17 metabolites.
So it's a little complex. It's
a little complex. Yeah. So just Google progesterone metabolites images, and you will see this like bicycle wheel of all the places it can go. Lots of different. And we're finding in research that more of the metabolites, they used to call them inactive, and they're not inactive. Right? Like they do stuff. They can do helpful stuff in the body.
Yeah. I'm gonna let us know that this is like our 6-minute warning.
Okay.
But we have a few more questions to go through.
Let's do it.
Next question: can high aromatase enzyme cause estrogen dominance in menstruating women or not?
Yeah, so remember, in order for women to make estrogen in the first place, you have to aromatize from the theca cells to the granulosa cells. And then we aromatize in our fat tissue as well to make primarily estrone. So yeah, absolutely. And if what I said just confused you, so when you make on your follicle is surrounded by theca cells, and theca cells make your androgens, and then they magically float over to your granulosa cells and aromatize into estrogen, primarily estradiol. And so aromatase is super, super important in the creation of hormones for women. And then in our fat cells, aromatase that makes estrone, and which is primarily how women, postmenopausal women, make estrogen, because their ovaries, the granulosa cells aren't on the follicles, don't have follicles. So it's the aromatization in the adipose tissue to estrone, which then can convert into estradiol for postmenopausal women. So yeah, aromatase is really critical. And in fact, for women with PCOS, what is it, CYP19, if you have an upregulated CYP19, you tend to have higher androgens because your aromatase, or excuse me, estrogens, because your aromatase is a lot higher, a lot more metabolically active.
So there is some kind of genetic SNP that can influence that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, next question. If someone has what appears to be a quicker than average estrogen metabolism, but their estrogen is within range, is this a good thing? And does it help prevent estrogen dominance? Or can it be a risk of low estrogen if the body metabolizes it too quickly?
Yes and yes. Yes and yes. So it depends if she's symptomatic or not. Remember the 16, so she has a fast detoxification. If her phase 1 metabolites are high, they are reactive oxygen species. So if her 16 is high, that is estrogenic. If her 4 is high, that is has an increased carcinogenic risk. It's the most carcinogenic pathway. So just want to make sure her phase 2 is working as well. We want to make sure all those phase 1 metabolites are getting neutralized into phase 2 through COMT, right? So it's a good thing for her if both phase 1 and phase 2 are working great and they can keep up with their estrogen is in range, then fantastic. Yay body. But it's possible that over time that fast metabolism is going to cause lower than desired estrogens, which we see in like menopausal women, right? Or even women just with low estrogen. You can, or if you accidentally give too much DIM, as an example, or indole 3-carbinol, you can pull estrogen out of circulation faster than you were thinking you would.
And that can exacerbate low estrogen symptoms.
Yep.
Totally. Yeah. I'm going to see if we can sneak in one more question here.
We actually have until, I think we can, because we haven't, I think until after, so I think we can go another.
Oh,
yeah, you can keep
what Amy said.
Going. Oh, okay, awesome, great. I was trying to be a good timekeeper, but I'll just let Amy cut us off.
I'd say keep going.
Perfect. Okay, great. All right. How can we treat estrogen dominance as naturally as possible? And a little addition says she doesn't want to use progesterone cream.
Well, remember, so there's two kinds of estrogen dominance. There's the estrogen dominance because you, in relation to progesterone, or you may have totally healthy, normal, excellent levels of progesterone, but your detoxification is not so great. So the good thing is at Dutch, this is a very, very, very passionate topic of ours, and we have lots of info on it. So in the chat box, Amy is going to link, we've got some great webinars. I've done some webinars. Dr. Tara Scott's done an amazing webinar, and I think she has a webinar coming up on it too. We have blog stuff about it. We have a lot on estrogen. We have videos like how to read the Dutch report on that estrogen section. So can you manage it as much natural as possible? Yes. Do you have to give progesterone? No, not necessarily, if estrogen is really what you're focusing on. So she will include those links for you so you can watch or read up on all of it.
Well, and I think too, like even like kind of leading into this question, like it's evaluating where that estrogen is coming from. Is it an aromatase issue? Is it a detox issue? Like being able to look at all of that. You don't have to have hormone therapy for any of those.
Right. So, I will say, I will add on that too, Dutch does not pick up exogenous environmental estrogen. So if you are wondering, did your, microwaving saran wrap use in your teens, is it affecting you now? We can't pick that up unless it's true estradiol, estrone, estriol, bioidentical. We don't see it on the Dutch test. Now, might that be impacting your symptoms, your metabolism? Absolutely, absolutely. If you know somebody has a lot of exposure to endocrine disruptors, for sure. But we just won't see it on Dutch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our next question is, how come you don't test for methoxy, E1, and E2? How do you measure up estrogen dominance, and what's the ratio to progesterone?
So for the 4-methoxy, stay tuned. 4-methoxy, all the 4-methoxy we're crossing fingers, it's coming. For that. And then how do you measure up estrogen dominance? What's the ratio to progesterone? So here's what's interesting, which we've been sort of talking about. So when we at Dutch look at estrogen dominance, we look at it through all the layers. So we look at Dutch results are on dials. They look like speedometers with arrows. And so I look at progesterone on the dial compared to estradiol's dial, and I look to see which dial is pointing higher, and that's how I know like if estradiol is dominant or not, or if they're pointing about the same direction. However, then I compare progesterone to the 2, 4, and 16. And then I compare progesterone to see how well she is going through phase 2 detoxification. And then if you have her stool results and you know what her beta-glucuronidase is, then I'm looking at progesterone compared to her phase 3 results of, is her estrogen recirculating because she it has high levels of beta-glucuronidase in her gut. And so when we think of the progesterone estrogen ratio, we think of it completely different than other labs, because we're literally looking at the different layers to say estradiol is estrogenic, but so 16. And so if she's 16 dominant compared to progesterone, she's going to have high estrogen symptoms. But 4 is carcinogenic potentially, so we have to be careful with that. And if she's not methylating, then she's not neutralizing. So then we have to be careful with that. And so it's a lot. What's great is that you can absolutely modify each of these levels with diet, lifestyle, and supplements, and make a big difference. And that's why I love looking at the different layers to go, okay, where is the issue that I can pinpoint and go, oh, it's right here. Like, oh, she doesn't need DIM. She doesn't need cruciferous veggies. But what she needs is magnesium, methionine, choline. Oh, she needs beta-glucuronidase. Like, oh, you did her stool test as well? Oh, that's why your estradiol is high. Like, let's look at calcium deglucarate while we're addressing the gut. So, which again, Dutch does not do stool testing, but a lot of you wonderful practitioners do it. So you just tell us. You just happen to have the result, and so you can tell us.
So we don't have a printed out ratio,
Correct.
Like an estrogen to progesterone ratio, because it is so much more complicated that you have to look at each component of that estrogen metabolism with the progesterone.
But you're just looking at the dial. So don't think it's a number. Don't think you have to come up with this magic ratio.
Yeah.
Just literally look at the arrows are facing. If the progesterone arrow is higher than the 16, or if the progesterone arrow is way lower than the 16, if the methylation gauge is low, meaning you're not methylating your estrogens very well. So it's visual. It's very simple. It's very quick. It's very visual. Like, oh, low methylation. Got it. Need to support COMT. Okay.
No calculations.
No calculations. Yeah.
It works for me.
Right. Keep it simple.
Yes. Yes. Okay, great. What does it mean when E1 and E2 are high or out of range, but the metabolites are all relatively low? Shouldn't there be a corresponding amount of metabolites?
Yes. That means that the estrogen metabolism is slow. So if E2 is high or out of range, and the 2, 4, and 16 are not, they're really low, then we know there's a problem. We know there's at least a phase 1 problem. Yeah. So got to work on that sluggish metabolism.
Yeah.
And also keep in mind phase 3. Again, we don't do stool testing, but you may have high levels of E1 and E2 because your estrobolome, your estrogen microbiome, is re-releasing estrogen that was tagged to go out. So by addressing the gut microbiome, you keep estrogen in its box with its bow on, and then you can effectively eliminate it literally out of the body. So you have to keep all the levels in mind.
As much as our test shows with estrogen metabolism, there are other components that influence that estrogen.
Yep.
Yeah.
And no, we are not going to become a stool test company either.
Urine's enough.
Yeah, urine's our thing.
Urine and saliva.
Exactly.
Okay, next up is protocols to help clients with low estrogen who are in their 20s and 30s and are not showing other signs of perimenopause.
So again, it's finding out why. So like I said earlier, we know that the estrogens are made when the GnRH tells the theca cells through LH to make androgens, and then it aromatizes into your estrogens through FSH. And so is it brain signaling? Is it follicular health? And then on top of that, what else is going on? What else would cause low estrogen in a woman? Well, being on birth control, right? Having PCOS, being underweight, over exercising, having hypothyroidism, being on certain medications like opioid medication or Accutane. How many women in their 20s are on Accutane, which is isotretinoin, or I think in other countries it's Roaccutane? That can be really suppressive. And so it's instead of like what herb raises estrogen in her 20s, it's first let's figure out why does she have low estrogen in her 20s? Like, what's her history? What's going on? And then work from there. Because there are absolutely estrogenic herbs out there. Like licorice is estrogenic, right? Hops and red clover. Like these things are, but they're not estrogenic as in they make more estrogen. They bind to estrogen receptors. That they're phytoestrogens in that regard. What you need is to get, in this question, is that you're trying to get from the brain to the theca cells to the granulosa cells to make more estrogen. And so now you're going to take a step back and go, okay, big picture, why is she not making estrogen at her age? Because if she's on opioids, or if she's on the birth control pill, or she's on Accutane, you're going to treat that way differently than if she's PCOS or untreated hypothyroid or underweight.
I also just want to remind people that timing is also very important.
Yes.
So making sure that you're getting, because, my luteal time might be very different than somebody else's luteal time. And so making sure that you're getting that right peak of estrogen, because sometimes we can maybe miss it depending on what they're doing, or maybe they aren't as consistent with their estrogen fluctuations from one cycle to the other, especially if they have estrogen dominant symptoms, but then they show up as kind of lower estrogen on the Dutch test. There may be a fluctuation in that estrogen presentation on the day of testing, because as awesome as our testing is, it is limited to that one day. And so the timing can also influence what is happening with those fluctuations of estrogens too. So,
and sometimes patients just don't read the instructions and collect on a random day, and then it turns out it was day 4 of their cycle. You're like,
yeah,
which happens more often than you would think.
It does.
Or somebody does the test today and their period starts completely randomly tomorrow.
Totally. Even though they tried to predict as much as they could. And again, that's fluctuations in estrogen, right? So.
Yep.
Yeah. Great.
Yep.
Is there any way to address a consistently too low 16-OH? And what is the real impact to bone loss in this situation? And how might one remediate or manage this?
This is one of my most favorite questions because I just did a lot of research into this very recently. So a consistently low 16-OH, how do you make 16? It's through your CYP3A4. So if there are things that can impact the function of CYP3A4. So the mutation makes it fast, but there are like medications and stuff, lifestyle stuff that can slow it down. So it's possible that it's a slow CYP3A4. How effective, how bone health related is it? It's related to bone health because it's estrogenic. It's not estrogenic compared to estradiol, but it is estrogenic. So the research they show is in postmenopausal women who have higher levels of 16-hydroxy, 16-OH, that they have less osteoporosis and osteopenia. But they don't have estradiol because they're postmenopausal. So the real core of the issue is that we need estradiol. That's the thing with bone health that the research is showing, because 16-OH is estrogenic. So maybe you need to work on their estradiol. Maybe you need to give them, depending on their age, estradiol or improve their estradiol. Should you speed up 16-OH? We get this question all the time. How do I speed up 16-OH? How do I make it faster? When on the Dutch test, we talk about all our CYPs, our CYPs, our 1A1, our 1B1, our 3A4. We are only talking about estrogen because that's the test we're looking at. These CYPs do lots of other work. We just don't talk about it. Your 3A4 metabolizes pretty much every medication or like thing that comes to your body. It's your major mover for detoxification, major. So if you speed it up or slow it down and you're just thinking very singularly estrogen, you've got your brain in a silo, you could be doing a lot of damage for him or her, because remember, 16-OH is the major mover. So if you slow it down, you're going to slow her detoxification down for so much. And if you speed it up, you're going to speed it up for so much that it touches. It's very similar to 1A1. So 1A1 goes down the 2 pathway. We like the 2 pathway. The 2 pathway is our less carcinogenic pathway. So we give DIM, right? We give DIM because what DIM does is DIM binds to what's called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor, ARYL, aryl. The aryl hydrocarbon receptor has more of a preference to the 1A1 compared to the 1B1, so it speeds up 1A1. The problem is 1A1 also metabolizes your polyaromatic hydrocarbons, your PAHs. Those are nasty. So if you're giving DIM and you're speeding up estrogen, you're like, yay me, I sped up estrogen. But he has a lot of exposure to PAHs. Now you've sped up the conversion of our PAHs into a phase 1 metabolite, which is what? More toxic than the original ingredient. So you have to make sure phase 2 is working too. You have to make sure that her COMT, the rest of metabolism, the rest of her liver clearance, the rest of phase 2 and 3 is working. So this is my soapbox when it comes to affecting enzymes or SNPs. When you individually affect a SNP because you're just looking at one hormone, oh, estradiol, I'm going to affect this. It's much greater than that. Please understand, or please look up everything that these SNPs touch, because you are singly impacting them, even though you think you're just working on estrogen. So do we speed up 16-OH? Maybe it depends on the person, right? Like we're careful, but with bone health, estradiol is at the core. So instead of speeding up 16-OH, focus on the estradiol. And lots of other ways to focus on bone health too, right? Like estradiol is great, but so is thyroid, so is testosterone, so are all the minerals, so is vitamin D. So there's a lot that goes into bone health.
Yeah.
Weightlifting.
Hey guys, let's do our last question.
Okay.
Okay.
What should we do?
I know.
Let's do the progesterone supplementation one on this page. Oh, should we that one or the 7 keto?
Oh gosh. I kind of want you to talk about the DHEA, but
we get that one a lot. 7 keto.
Yeah, that's true. We do. Okay, let's do that one.
Amy said we can do another one.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to do the progesterone first or DHEA first?
Well, Amy said one more, so let's just do 7 keto.
And we'll go ahead and do both of them since you're debating. Let's do them both.
Okay. we like both of them. Okay. I'll ask the DHEA first though. Okay. I would love to have Dr. Jones address the 7 keto conversion of DHEA. I haven't heard a lot about this form of DHEA and how it might affect the person, the test. Does it need to be discontinued before the test? All of that good stuff. Just general thoughts about it would be great.
Yes. So 7 keto DHEA is also known as 7-oxo, OXO. So if you PubMed it, you'll look up that one as well. So what happens is DHEA converts into 7-alpha and 7-beta hydroxy DHEA. So that conversion is irreversible. You can't go back the other way. And then 7-alpha and 7-beta makes 7 keto. That sort of like comes to like an inverted triangle.
Little funnel.
Down here. Yeah, like a funnel. Or 7-oxo, which is also what it's called. So with 7 keto, a lot of people like it for weight loss, because there's a couple reasons why they like it for weight loss. One, it's thought to, these metabolites are thought to bind to 11-beta HSD1. So if you recall, 11-beta HSD1 activates cortisone into cortisol. But if you bind it up, then it can't make more cortisol. So especially if you have a lot of adipose tissue and you are activating a lot of cortisol, the thought is that 7 keto, or excuse me, the 7 keto can, its metabolites, 7-alpha, 7-beta hydroxy, can bind to 11-beta HSD1, and therefore you won't make a lot of cortisol and it won't perpetuate the spare tire around the middle. So that's one of the things. One of the other things they say in some of the rat studies is that it increases thermogenesis, your mitochondria, right? Your uncoupling, it increases your UCPs, your uncoupling proteins, increases thermogenesis. And then there was a small study that showed 100 milligrams of 7-keto DHEA given twice a day, so 200 total. With dietary changes and an exercise plan, they had more weight loss than the group that did just the dietary and just the exercise. So the placebo group actually still did the diet and exercise, but not the supplement. And they found that they had more weight loss. Now, do we find 7-keto to be like a magic weight loss pill? Well, no, because if it was a magic weight loss pill, then I would have created one and I would be a billionaire at this point, because everybody would want to take it, of course. But for some people, it can be really helpful. We absolutely have positive, feedback from people who say it has helped them in the weight loss plan. Do you need to stop it before the Dutch test? We say yes, even though it's irreversible and it doesn't convert back to testosterone or the other metabolites that we test. We still advise that you do stop it prior to Dutch testing, so that you can get that baseline. Do you have anything to add on 7-keto?
I don't think so. Yeah, nope.
Yeah. So if it's cortisol, lowering cortisol, possibly thermogenesis in I almost said bunnies, in rats. And then in that study showing 100 milligrams twice a day with diet and exercise was effective.
Okay, last question.
Progesterone, this is a juicy one.
Yes, and this is the one, I want to make sure I have the right one. Can progesterone supplementation increase risk for developing?
Yes.
Is that the one you want? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, last question. Can progesterone supplementation increase risk for developing estrogen-sensitive cancer in case of bad estrogen metabolism? Go.
So, as far as we know, progesterone supplementation does not increase the estrogen-sensitive cancer risk of bad estrogen metabolism. So progesterone supplementation doesn't appear to affect like the 2,4,16 stuff like that. However, in some cell studies, the pregnanes that I was talking that show up on Dutch test, the 5-alpha pregnanes are have been shown to be increased cell proliferation and I can't remember what the other word, detachment, cell proliferation and detachment in cancer. And so there is some concern that if you give the oral or the sublingual progesterone, because of these cell studies, that you're going to increase the 5-alpha. The oral and the sublingual progesterone increase both 5-alpha and 5-beta together, but alpha definitely goes up. And so by increasing 5-alpha, that you could increase the risk for cell proliferation and detachment. I have not seen human trials on this. It's just something that gets talked about and brought up like it's in some cell studies. But I haven't seen any human studies. And again, but I will greatly point out that neither Dr. Rice and I are oncologists. We don't do oncology. We didn't do oncology prior to working with Dutch, and there are probably much better oncology specific practitioners who can answer this question better. But I do want to point out that those cell studies on the 5-alpha pregnanes and that 5-alpha pathway and how potentially it could increase the risk for cell proliferation. Now, having said that, people go, oh, well, then I'll just use cream. I'll use cream because then it won't go through first pass and raise the alphas. And that's an option, but it is also the 5-alpha that helps with anxiety and sleep. And for a lot of people, potentially hot flashes and sense of well-being and night sweats and stuff like that. And so, and there are a lot of people, as we know, I mean, there just aren't the studies on it. There just aren't the human studies on unfortunately, on that particular part, the 5-alpha pregnanes, breast cancer moving forward. And so, yes. So those are in cell studies. But we're not oncologists. So if you do oncology and you're like, I completely disagree with you, please let us know. Like, we just wanted to pass
Yes, do you have any information?
For sure. If you're like, no, they have done human studies, it's really new, like let us know, because we would like to pass that information along to people. Because we like oral progesterone, prometrium, unless you have a peanut allergy, or compounded or sublingual progesterone, the drops, the progesterone drops. Like, we like all that for the anxiety and the sleep and the sense of well-being.
It works wonderfully.
Yeah, really well, but we obviously don't want to, increase any kind of risks if we know better.
Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
All right, ladies.
Hey.
Thank you so much today. And thanks everyone for logging on, taking a listen to our experts. And like I said, we look forward to doing this again in November. So have your questions ready. I'm sorry if we didn't get to everybody's. Again, we received over 200 questions prior to the webinar. I know a lot of you were shooting some questions our way during the webinar. So look forward to the two of these gals, these Dutch experts, in November.
Yay.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Carrie and Debbie.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Amy.
you.
Bye.
Bye.